All right, is everyone fine with being recorded?
Yes.
Yeah.
Woo!
They consent.
Okay, is everyone ready?
Give me 1 second.
Okay.
Listo.
So just to confirm, everyone's all right. Yeah, before I start this round, congrats on making finals, and this is going to be fun. So with that, my time starts now. We affirm the resolution that the United States federal government should remove denuclearization as a condition of diplomatic relations with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Again, the United States federal government should remove denuclearization as a condition of diplomatic relations with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. So first, let me go into some definitions. Obviously, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea is a North Korean regime. Diplomatic relations include things like accepting aid, green energy technology, for example, and this aid is going directly to the starving citizens of North Korea. And we also see that diplomatic aid is a prerequisite to increasing cooperation, which also means that North Korea is going to be able to cooperate with inspections and investigations that the United States has. So the denuclearization, removing denuclearization as a condition, like right now what's happening is that these diplomatic actions can only happen if North Korea agrees to denuclearize. So the plan is going to be fundamentally changing that. There's a couple of reasons why Kim Jong-un is not going to give up his nuclear weapons. The first reason is because he wants to stay in power. We see that military power is the only, one of the only ways that the Kim Jong-un regime stays in power. Second, we see that even in the past and even very recently, he's been building up his nuclear arsenal, so there's no reason that he's going to stop all of this from happening now. And the third reason is that current countries like China, for example, aren't doing their part in actually in denouncing the nuclear program because they're more focused on issues at home. So China, for example, cares more about the quote-unquote stability of the Kim Jong-un regime. They don't really necessarily, they're not really stopping them from increasing nuclear weapons. The second solvency argument is going to be that the reason diplomatic actions have failed in the past is because the United States always has denuclearization as a condition. You can literally look to the last 50 years of foreign policy where the United States keeps telling the Kim Jong-un regime to denuclearize, and they continue building up their nuclear arsenal. The third solvency argument is going to be that in the long run, diplomatic actions are a prerequisite to solving for denuclearization. Because right now, we see that even if Kim Jong-un says, hey guys, I'm going to denuclearize, he's not necessarily going to do that. The only reason or the only way that we can actually enforce this is to have diplomatic relations with the country, because this means that they're agreeing to enforcement mechanisms and to monitoring mechanisms. So expert Revin from the UN notes that gradual policy change again is going to be the most effective because it means we're going to solve for demilitarization in the future. So with that, our first argument. Our first argument is going to be that of declining U.S. legitimacy. We see that right now the United States has attempted basically trying to assert dominance in this area to continue North Korea to denuclearize. But again, all previous attempts have been successful. This year, despite Trump and Kim Jong-un's talks just 2 weeks ago, North Korea constructed new nuclear research facilities as well as several missile launch sites, which means that they're continuing to expand their nuclear arsenal right now. Several North Korean ministers have also stated that the United States is being somewhat of an intrusive force in stripping North Korea of its defense. And again, whenever the United States starts to have the conditions of denuclearization, North Korea just wants to increase their weapons because, it looks, they want to continue their defense. They want to continue this military brava that they have. So We also see that most North Korean citizens support the nuclear program as well because they're swayed with propaganda, which means North Korean citizens also support the nuclear weapon program. From Bangkok University, experts believe that Kim Jong-un will never accept any agreements to denuclearize because he hasn't, again, he's invested so much time and resources into actually building these weapons. And if he simply denuclearizes, he loses all legitimacy. We also see that our Southeast Asian allies have cause for us to be more realistic with North Korean negotiations. Specifically, we see that Malaysia, Japan, and Singapore are losing trust in U.S. diplomacy because it looks really bad when we're not able to solve for all these issues as the United States. So the links are that passing the plan means that Kim Jong-un will abide to other negotiations that still help in the status quo. Also, we're going to be, again, engaging in a solution where our allies, again, want to act, and this is going to increase trust. The first impact here is going to be that of global war. We see that when our allies lose trust in American leadership, they themselves militarize, right? Because now it looks like Kim Jong-un has the possibility, has the potential to attack them, which means we're going to see all of these countries in the in this area in Asia that are going to increase their military weapons. For example, Japan and Indonesia are considering like the whole Article 9 thing. We see that like more military means that there's an increased chance of mass war. Not only is there an increased chance of misfire because now all of these countries are building up their nuclear arsenals, but also we're going to be, again, making sure what's going to happen is that even if there isn't a misfire, these countries are incentivized to fire. The second impact here is going to be that of lives. We see that nonprofits, specifically in Southeastern Asia, that the United States works with, are saving 2 million lives in the status quo, which means our allies are really, really important to continuing these nonprofits that the United States has and is working with. The second argument is going to be that of human rights violations. Right now, we see that all political opposition is restricted in North Korea. There's no independent news media, there's no civil society, and trade unions aren't allowed. And this is because the Kim Jong-un regime, again, wants to maintain control. What this means is that there's a lot of ministers and North Korean officials that are subjecting crimes against humanity. These crimes include things like extermination, murder, imprisonment, and forced abortion. And again, courts don't try these officials fairly, so there's no way that the status quo is going to solve. We see that over 700,000 people are in prisons, and these prisons are detrimental as well. Prisons are also hard to locate, so raids from other countries in the area have also failed. The UNDP estimates that currently over 1 million North Koreans are in dehumanizing places, and we see that foreign policy experts have stated that, again, we need to engage in diplomatic action to solve for this. So the links, passing the AF plan, again, has a different approach to policy making because of 3 reasons. First, because they want our aid, which means that they're going to stop these like human rights violations. Second, the aid provided reduces the need for imprisonment camps because it's helping the North Korean economy. And third, the aid goes directly to starving citizens, so it's the most direct way to actually help. And we see that through monitoring, these programs, that is going to mean that North Korea is going to comply. So at the end of the day, you're going to be voting for the affirmative because North Korea is never going to demilitarize. So the only way that we can actually achieve diplomatic, we can actually achieve good diplomatic results is without the condition. For those reasons, I affirm.
So the order will be the off case and then the affirmative. Alright, and then kind of an overview on top. Everybody good? Only reason right now that we are negotiating with North Korea is because we have something that we want. We specifically want them to denuclearize, and that is the only reason why people like Trump and Pompeo are in North Korea right now trying to get things done. It is only through this path are we actually able to get marginal concessions and marginal progress towards restoring diplomatic relations. If all of a sudden U.S. policy shifts towards us not wanting anything from them and us not requesting anything from them, all of a sudden this means that Trump and Pompeo have absolutely nothing that they want, which means that they will just pull out. That's the overview of the negative position, and I'll get more into that later. But first, let's get into the disadvantage and what's happening and setting up the context of the disadvantage. So what's happening right now in the status quo? the uniqueness right now for this is that current negotiations, the current U.S. hardline stance on asking very hard for this denuclearization is working. We can see that recently at the UN General Assembly, the North Korean minister said that we would be able to denuclearize if the U.S. would make concessions. And currently they are on a path now to actually make concessions towards each other because both countries have stated in their explicit policies they need to get this, they need to get this. So naturally, with these negotiations, they will slowly work towards a compromise. However, in addition, we can see that also there are external factors that are causing the status quo to de-escalate in North Korea right now. For example, we can see that the South Korean president was newly elected last year, and he has been much better on terms with relation to North Korea and reunification of the Korean Peninsula than his predecessor. This means that from two fronts, with U.S. hardline negotiating with North Korea to get a compromise, and with South Korea and North Korea negotiating together because they know each other better, they are causing North Korea to de-escalate and pretty much better their society. So this is what is happening right now. In addition, we can also see that in the status quo, Russia is very supportive of the U.S.'s hardline stance against North Korea, saying you need to denuclearize. And we can see that they're actually in support of this. They came out in support of this, which is going to be really, really important. So they could actually even called it a main policy for 2018. But what happens when the plan passes? And in order to understand what happens when the plan passes, we have to understand kind of what exactly the negotiators would actually do within our government. It would be really great if we had some really awesome people in our government that would just be able to give this up and then go away and let North Korea do their own thing. But the problem is our government is run by people who really, really only want certain things. And if all of a sudden the U.S. policy is to say, no, we don't really care about denuclearization, that means our negotiators like Trump and Pompeo all of a sudden have absolutely zero incentive to even be in North Korea in the first place. They won't care about North Korea anymore because the government is telling them, yeah, really, the one thing that you wanted, you can't have it. And if the U.S. government and have people like Trump and Pompeo, and they get told you can't have what you want, then they have absolutely no reason left to stay in there. And all of a sudden, the negotiations that are coming to slow compromises together from both sides' hardline stance of wanting concessions from each other goes away. Essentially what would happen is we would go to the time before there were even negotiations that are happening now in the first place. For example, we would go to the time where there used to be a lot of tension between us because neither country was even talking to each other. For example, we would go back to a time, the reason why we'd go back to a time where no country was even talking to each other is specifically because the people that run our government, that negotiate with North Korea, are just like, okay, we can't get the thing that we really, really want anymore. It's pretty much useless anymore to be here. Remember, Trump is an irrational actor. He would simply tell these people, North Korea is a lost cause, just pull out, and he has the power, executive authority to do this. So what exactly does this previous time look like? This previous time has meant that there were absolutely no negotiations, which means that we couldn't even get to some sort of concessions with denuclearization, whether it's denuclearizing certain bases or letting the U.S. officials test certain facilities. And in addition, we would see that the time before these negotiations occurred, which started with the Trump meeting, stalemated, and then recently was reinvigorated at the UN General Assembly, where they were nights filled with angry tweets, and we can see that there were a lot of nuclear tests that caused seismic activity, and there were a lot of irrational actors involved that had a high amount of tension. There was no negotiating between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump in the world where neither country took a hardline stance. But with this hardline stance, they are now able to work towards each other's goals. That's why Trump and Pompeo are in North Korea in the first place. So, obviously, that would be really bad. For example, we can see that if the U.S. completely pulls out of North Korea, that would ultimately mean that they are able to go back to their activities. That'd be especially bad. That'd be especially bad because there'd be more North Korean nukes because we aren't even able to get a foot in there in the first place. Ultimately, there would be a high risk of miscalculation. And in addition, we'd also anger Russia. Russia is extremely supportive and called this a top priority, which means that if all of a sudden we go back on our promises to Russia, they'd be especially angered. We can see that they always backlash when we go against what they want. For example, when we put tariffs on them, they increase their military activity in Syria, which is an indication that when they get angry, they seem to lash out at the U.S. And this Russia backlash could ultimately harm elections in Macedonia and cause populism to rise and have increased nationalism because the Russians would support this would support these nationalists in Macedonia, and also they would ultimately increase military drills with China, ultimately increasing the amount of tension within the area, leading to miscalculation, a high rate of miscalculation that would result in war. Because miscalculation right now, without both countries talking to each other, is the most likely scenario to war. Both Trump and Kim Jong-un are extremely irrational actors, and the only way to keep them away from war right now is to have these negotiations, and the only reason these negotiations are existent in the first place is because both countries have hardline stances that they are taking to slowly work together. And now, obviously, war is bad because it causes massive environmental degradation, which causes a lot of death and deforestation. Now let's look over the affirmative case. And first, let's go to the top of their plan. They have a few, and so first you can look to how the status quo is actually solving the entirety of their plan right now. So I don't think it's going to be a much issue. But we can also look to issues as to how we can also look to issues as to how the plan essentially would make it so that we would not even be able to be there in the first place, so we wouldn't be able to solve the case. They have this tiny little blip that says diplomatic relations are a prerequisite to getting denuclearization, but remember, Trump and Pompeo's mindset comes before this diplomatic relations. Because if the U.S. government all of a sudden says, you can't get this with your negotiations, then to establish diplomatic relations, then the irrationality of Trump and Pompeo simply would just pull out of the region because they can't get any more concessions. I think this is much more reasonable than them trying to stay in and get nothing out of it, because remember, the only thing that the U.S. wants is denuclearization. Then they say, so then they talk about a little bit about how we're currently losing a lot of U.S. legitimacy. However, we can see a few problems with this. First, the U.S. giving up the stance would actually hurt its legitimacy because it is seen internationally as losing to North Korea in diplomatic relations in this diplomatic contest, which means that all of the reasons they tell you why the U.S. having good international legitimacy would be bad or would be good, those actually flow for our side. In addition, we can see that Singapore and regional countries don't want North Korea to have nuclear weapons either because they don't want an irrational actor around them that can fire a nuke up into the air and hit a U.S. ally, which means the U.S. giving up this stance would actually make the Philippines or the Singapore and those regional actors a lot more scared, make Japan a lot more scared, make South Korea a lot more scared, which means that that's the only path to actually an arms race. And finally, they say that there's going to be increasing military weapons. Again, we would see that this giving up this concession, pretty much clause, would be the only path to people getting scared. Then they talk about human rights in North Korea, and again, I don't think this was able to solve for much, because the U.S. and improving human rights was never a priority for the U.S. in the first place in North Korea. And in addition,